On a grey October morning in the hill country of Tennessee, with the first frost still clinging to the fence posts and the smell of wood smoke drifting down from somewhere up the ridge, Dale Cutter stood at the edge of his back 40 and stared at a field that was slowly killing him. Not in the way that hard work kills a man. Dale had known hard work his entire adult life and wore it the way other men wear a badge. This was a different kind of killing, the slow, quiet, bankrupting kind, the kind that comes when 3 consecutive harvests fall short, when the bank starts calling on Thursdays instead of waiting for the monthly statement, when you lie awake at 2 in the morning listening to the silence and trying to calculate for the 100th time whether this year is the year it all finally comes apart. The field in front of him was compacted, not just dry, not just hard. Compacted in the way that only decades of heavy machinery rolling over wet Tennessee clay can compact soil. The kind of compaction that goes down 14-15 inches, forming what agronomists call a hard pan, though Dale's father had always called it by a simpler and more fitting name. He called it dead ground, ground that looks like dirt but behaves like pavement, ground that turns away water, turns away roots, turns away every attempt at correction with the same indifferent stubbornness. Dale's yields had been dropping for 6 years. He had blamed the weather first, the way most men do. Then he had blamed the seed suppliers. Then reluctantly he had started to blame himself, though he was not entirely sure what he had done wrong. He had done everything the county extension office told him to do. He had done everything the equipment dealer told him to do. He had done, in fact, everything that every pamphlet and webinar and sponsored field day had told him to do for the past 20 years. He had bought the new planter with the precision depth technology. He had bought the GPS-guided tractor that could drive a straighter line than any human. He had bought the variable rate applicator that could adjust seed and fertilizer placement in real time based on soil maps he had paid a consultant $4,000 to produce. He had bought and bought and bought, and every year the yields had slid a little further, and every year the loan balance had climbed a little higher, and now he was standing at the edge of a field that the bank had quietly flagged in an internal document as a doubtful asset, though nobody had told him that yet. Let me tell you about Dale Cutter, because you need to understand the kind of man he was before you can understand the kind of man he became. Dale had taken over the farm from his father at 31, when his father's knees had finally surrendered to 60 years of walking hard ground. He had a business degree from the University of Tennessee, which he had framed and hung in the farm office next to a photograph of himself shaking hands with the State Secretary of Agriculture at a young farmer conference. He subscribed to 3 agricultural technology magazines. He drove a late-model diesel pickup that he replaced every 4 years because, in the farming communities of that part of Tennessee, your truck is a form of communication, and Dale had always been careful about what he communicated. He was not a bad man. That needs to be said plainly. He was hard-working, and he loved his land, and he was trying, with everything he had, to keep a multi-generational farm alive in an era that seemed deliberately designed to make that impossible. But he had come to believe, the way a man absorbs beliefs without ever consciously choosing them, that newer was better, that bigger was smarter, that the old ways had been superseded for good reason, and that anyone still practicing them was simply behind. He had, in other words, the particular kind of pride that mistakes familiarity with technology for wisdom. His compaction problem had not appeared overnight. It had been building for 15 years, laid down in layers by the 30-ton grain cart he ran across wet fields in wet autumns because the harvest window was narrow and the elevator closed at 5 and you did what you had to do. Each pass of that cart at 12 to 14 miles per hour across saturated clay had pressed the subsoil tighter. Each year the roots of his corn and soybeans had reached down found the hardpan at 14 inches and spread sideways like a hand pressed against a ceiling, unable to go deeper, unable to reach the moisture and minerals that lived in the undisturbed subsoil below. The plants looked fine from the road. They always look fine from the road. But Dale could see it in the yield monitor data, field by field, year by year. The slow hemorrhage of productivity that nobody's software could reverse, because nobody's software was addressing the actual problem, which was underground and invisible, and as old as the error of putting weight on wet ground in the first place. He had tried everything the modern playbook offered. He had attempted deep tillage with a ripper, a 7-shank machine pulled by his most powerful tractor, a 400-horsepower row crop tractor that cost as much as a suburban house. The ripper had worked in the dry years, cracking the hardpan into rough chunks that the subsequent seasons could work on. But in a wet fall, which in Tennessee happens more often than the brochures suggest, the ripper shanks would pull sideways out of their trip springs rather than break the hardpan, and the machine would bounce across the surface like a skipping stone, tearing the topsoil and accomplishing nothing useful below. He had tried cover crops and they had helped at the margins, but the biology needed time that his loan schedule did not provide. He had tried a subsoil aerator pulled behind a smaller tractor at a walking pace, and it had improved 2 fields that were only moderately compacted, but it bounced off the back 40 the way a nail bounces off cast iron. The back 40 was the heart of the problem. 42 acres of the best situated ground on the farm, south-facing, naturally well-drained. The kind of ground his grandfather had farmed with horses and produced 60-bushel corn on when 60 bushels was considered exceptional. Under Dale's management, with all his technology and inputs and precision guidance systems, it was now producing 93 bushels in a good year when the county average was 160. He had shown the soil cores to 3 agronomists. 2 of them had shrugged and suggested he try a different ripper configuration. The third had looked at the hardpan layer for a long moment, tapped it with his thumbnail. It rang like ceramic, and said quietly that in his opinion the only thing that would break that layer without destroying the topsoil above it was slow, sustained, downward pressure applied at the right angle over the right duration. Then he had paused and said he did not know of any current commercial equipment designed specifically for that combination of factors. Dale had driven home from that meeting in silence and had not spoken about it to his wife for 3 days. Let me tell you about the morning Elias Cord turned up the farm road in that truck. It was the 2nd week of November. Dale was in the equipment barn doing the kind of maintenance work that farmers do in November, the work that accumulates all season and waits for the first hard cold to announce that the growing year is truly finished. He heard the truck before he saw it, which is saying something because the farm road was a 1/4 mile from the barn. It was not a loud truck in the way of trucks with modified exhausts or deliberate noise. It was loud in the way of trucks that are very old and have never been made quiet, a loose, rattling, entirely honest noise that communicated the mechanical history of 30 years in a single, sustained chord. The truck was a 1967 Ford F250 in a color that had once been green and was now the particular non-color that old paint becomes when the sun and rain have had their full say. The bed was wooden slatted and carried under a tarp secured with baling twine, something large and angular whose shape Dale could not immediately identify. The driver's side door opened with the protesting creak of hinges that had been persuaded rather than oiled, and Elias Cord stepped out. He was 79 years old that November, though he carried it in the way of men who have worked outdoors their entire lives with a kind of weathered density rather than frailty. He was not tall. He wore Carhartt canvas trousers that had been washed so many times they had passed through brown and arrived at a kind of dignified ochre. His hands, when he extended one to Dale, were the hands of a man who had spent 7 decades in actual contact with actual ground, thick-knuckled and calloused in specific places that only come from specific work. "Elias Cord," he said. "My family farmed the Cord Hollow up past the second ridge for about 110 years. I heard you've got a hardpan problem in your back field." Dale shook the hand and did not ask how he had heard, because in rural Tennessee, information about a neighbor's troubles travels with the efficiency of groundwater. He told Elias that yes, he had a hardpan problem, and that he had tried a number of approaches that had not solved it. Elias nodded once, as though Dale had confirmed something he already knew. "I might be able to help you with that," he said, "if you'd like to show me the field first." They drove out in Dale's truck, and Elias walked the back 40 for 40 minutes without saying a single word that was not directly relevant to the ground under his feet. He knelt twice and pressed his fingers into the soil. He studied the way the residue was lying and the way water had pooled in certain low spots after the last rain. He found a spot near the east fence line where a volunteer tree had pushed up through the hardpan, and he stood there for a while looking at the roots. Then he turned to Dale and said, "The pan's at about 13 inches in most of the field, 14.5 near the headlands where you've been turning. It's even and consistent, which is actually good news, means it can be addressed with a consistent method." Dale asked what method he had in mind. "I have an implement," Elias said. "It's old, it doesn't look like much, but it was designed for exactly this kind of problem, and the physics of the design are correct. What your rippers can't do is apply truly vertical downward pressure at slow speed. They're designed for horizontal movement. What this soil needs is something that goes down before it goes forward." Dale looked at the shape under the tarp in the bed of the old green truck and asked what exactly was under there. Elias allowed himself a small, quiet smile. "A Giddings soil probe conversion," he said. "Originally a core sampling rig from 1949. My grandfather modified it in the late 1950s for deep penetration tillage. It's not a production implement. It was a one-of-a-kind thing he built because he had this exact problem on our ground after we started running heavier equipment post-war. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever encountered something that looked completely wrong for the job and turned out to be the only thing capable of doing it? Have you ever dismissed an approach as outdated or primitive or simply not credible and then had to sit with the quiet discomfort of having been completely incorrect? Because what Dale Cutter did next tells you everything about the kind of man he was in November of that year. And what happened after that tells you everything about the kind of man he became." He laughed. Not a cruel laugh. Dale was not a cruel man. But the particular laugh of a person who is operating from certainty and has encountered something that strikes them as self-evidently absurd. A one-of-a-kind farm implement built in the 1950s by someone's grandfather, driven to the site in a truck that belonged in a county fair display, offered as the solution to a problem that 3 credentialed agronomists and $40,000 of commercial equipment had failed to resolve. He apologized for the laugh almost immediately, the way a person does when they catch themselves being impolite. But Elias Cord had been watching people laugh at things they did not yet understand for most of his 79 years, and he was neither offended nor deterred. He simply waited for the laugh to finish, and then asked if Dale wanted to see what the implement did. Let me tell you about the Giddings conversion because it deserves to be understood. The original Giddings soil probe was a hydraulically driven core sampling machine manufactured in Fort Collins, Colorado, beginning in the late 1940s. Its purpose was scientific, driving hollow steel tubes into undisturbed soil to extract intact cores for analysis. The genius of its design was its vertical drive mechanism, which applied hydraulic pressure straight down along the axis of the probe rather than at the forward angle that tillage equipment typically uses. It was built to overcome resistance, not to avoid it. Elias's grandfather, a man named Warren Cord, who had farmed that hollow since returning from the Pacific in 1945, had watched a Giddings rig work on an experimental plot at the County Extension Station in 1956, and had seen with the practical eye of a farmer who had been fighting hardpan for 10 years that the vertical drive principle could be adapted for tillage. He had spent 2 winters in his shop with a welder and a collection of salvaged steel and an understanding of hydraulics that was partly intuitive and partly self-taught from a machinery manual he had ordered from a university press. What he had built was not elegant. It had never been intended for elegance. It was a frame of heavy square-section steel, purpose-built to mount on the 3-point hitch of a tractor, carrying 3 vertical chisel points on independent hydraulic cylinders that could each be driven to a precisely controlled depth before the tractor moved forward. The machine worked in what Warren had called the punch-and-step method. Stop, drive the points down through the hardpan, lift, move forward 18 inches, stop again. It was agonizingly slow. On Warren's old Farmall M, covering the back 40 the first time had taken 11 days. But when it was done, those 40 acres had produced the best corn the Cord family had ever grown on that ground, and they had continued to produce well for the following 7 years without retreatment. The machine had passed to Elias's father, who had used it twice on neighboring farms during the 1960s when the first wave of heavy post-war equipment began compacting bottomland fields across the county. Then it had sat in a corner of the Cord barn under a canvas sheet for 30 years, through the era when deep tillage rippers became the standard solution and everyone assumed the problem was solved. Elias had restored it in the 1990s after he began watching the ripper failures repeat themselves on farms throughout the county, replacing the hydraulic seals and reground the chisel points and remounted it on his grandfather's rebuilt Ford tractor with the slow-speed hydraulic pump that the design required. He had used it 4 times since the restoration. Each time it had done exactly what Warren Cord had designed it to do. It took Elias an hour and a half to set up. He asked Dale's hired man to move a feed wagon so he had a straight approach to the field from the barn lane, and he spent 20 minutes adjusting the hydraulic pressure on each of the 3 cylinders with a hand gauge that he carried in a leather pouch with his other tools. He checked the depth stops twice. He walked the first 20 rows of the field and pressed a marking flag into the ground every 18 inches, the first 100 feet of what would be a methodical grid covering the entire 42 acres. Dale watched all of this from the fence. His hired man, a practical young man named Travis who had grown up on a cattle operation and had strong opinions about equipment efficiency, stood beside him and said at one point, in a voice that carried more than he intended, that this was going to take forever. Elias either did not hear this or chose not to acknowledge it. He climbed into the cab of the old Ford tractor, started it with the deliberate sequence of steps that old machinery requires, and moved to the first flag. What happened over the following 4 hours was not dramatic in the way of explosions or mechanical failures or voices raised in argument. It was dramatic in the way that patience is dramatic when you have never truly seen it before. The old tractor stopped at the flag. The 3 hydraulic cylinders descended with a low, sustained groan of applied pressure, the chisel points going down through 6 inches of topsoil and into the hard pan below. There was a sound at 13 inches that Dale would later describe, unsuccessfully, to his wife, a sound somewhere between a crack and a sigh. As the first point broke through, then the next, then the third, the cylinders lifted, the tractor moved forward precisely 18 inches. It stopped again. Punch, lift, step, punch, lift, step. Travis gave up, watching after the second row, and went back to fixing a hydraulic fitting on the grain cart. Dale stayed at the fence. Let me tell you about what Dale Cutter was thinking at that fence. He was thinking, initially, about time. 42 acres at 18-inch increments, 3 points wide, working at approximately 60 feet per hour, including the stops. He was doing the arithmetic in his head and arriving at numbers that seemed to confirm Travis's assessment. This was going to take a very long time, possibly the rest of November, but he kept watching, and somewhere in the second hour he stopped doing arithmetic and started watching something else. He started watching the soil that was being displaced upward around each chisel point as it was withdrawn. He got off the fence and walked into the field alongside the tractor and knelt and looked at it closely. The hard pan, that ceramic hard layer that his thumbnail had once rung against, was coming up in broken chunks around the probe holes, fractured vertically rather than smeared horizontally the way a ripper leaves it. The soil above the hard pan was undisturbed. The structure of the topsoil, the crumb structure that decades of organic matter and earthworm activity had built, was completely intact. His ripper, when it worked at all, worked by brute horizontal force. It tore through everything, hard pan and topsoil alike, leaving a shattered profile that took 2 or 3 seasons of biological activity to begin rebuilding. This machine was doing something different. It was doing surgery. Dale walked back to the fence and stood there for another 2 hours. On the 4th day, Elias had covered 20 acres. On the 8th day, he had covered 31. On the 14th day, which was a Friday in late November, with the temperature sitting at 31 degrees and a thin skin of ice on the water trough, he finished the last row of the back 40, lifted the implement, drove the old Ford to the edge of the field, shut down the engine, and sat for a moment in the cab before climbing down. Dale was there. He had been there for most of every day. Elias stepped down from the tractor and walked to the first row he had worked and knelt in the soil for the last time. He pressed his fingers down through the loose topsoil and kept going down past the depth where the hard pan had been into the subsoil below. His fingers went to the 3rd knuckle without resistance. He looked up at Dale. "It's done," he said. Dale did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked how much he owed. Elias said what he always said. The time and the diesel were no charge. If the field performed the way he expected it to perform, Dale could make a donation to the Harlan County Agricultural Heritage Museum in whatever amount he felt was appropriate. They had a collection of early farm implements that needed a new display building, and they had been trying to raise money for it for 4 years. Dale said that was not sufficient. Elias said it was what he asked, and that he did not want anything more than that. They shook hands at the edge of the treated field, while the light went out of the sky and the temperature dropped toward a hard freeze, and Elias Cord drove his old green truck back up the farm road and disappeared over the ridge. Let me tell you about the following spring. Dale planted the back 40 on the 14th of April, 3 days earlier than he had been able to plant it in any of the previous 8 years because the soil drained and warmed faster without the hard pan impeding water movement. He planted it with the same variety he had used throughout the county, the same seed population, the same starter fertilizer program. He did nothing different except that the ground was different. By the 1st of June, he could see it from the road. He could see it clearly from the road, which had never been true of that field before. The corn in the back 40 was visibly, obviously, uncomplicatedly better than the corn in his other fields. The color was darker. The plants were taller for their calendar age. When he pulled plants for root sampling in late June, the roots went straight down past 20 inches into undisturbed subsoil, finding moisture during the July dry period that the plants in compacted fields never reached. He harvested the back 40 on the 23rd of September. The yield monitor read 187 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 159. He sat in the combine cab at the end of the last pass and looked at the yield map on his monitor for a long time. 187 bushels. On ground that had been producing 93. On ground that 3 agronomists had looked at and essentially given up on. On ground that an elderly man in an old green truck had fixed with a machine his grandfather had built from salvaged steel in a barn in the 1950s. He drove to Elias Cord's farm the next morning. The Cord place was up a hollow road that Dale had driven past his entire life without ever turning into. It was the kind of farm that you can see has been loved for generations in the specific way that differs from farms that have simply been operated. The fences were old but maintained, the barn was large, and its roof was sound. There was a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the winter with straw mulch in precise rows. The farmhouse was white-clapboard, and the porch had a swing that looked like it had been in continuous use since Eisenhower. Elias was in the barn when Dale arrived. He was disassembling the hydraulic cylinder on the Giddings conversion with the careful deliberateness of a man who maintains his tools immediately after use rather than leaving them for later. He looked up when Dale's truck came into the barn lot and gave the same quiet nod he had given the first morning on the farm road. Dale told him the yield, 187 bushels. Elias nodded again as though this confirmed something he had already known, but was nevertheless satisfied to have confirmed. "That's about what Warren got the first year after," he said. "It'll stay up there too, as long as you don't drive heavy equipment on it when it's wet." Dale said he owed him an apology. He said he had laughed at him. He said he had stood at that fence on the first day calculating how long it was going to take and thinking privately that the old man was wasting his time and Dale was wasting his patience. He said he was sorry for all of that. Elias set down the wrench he was holding and looked at Dale directly for the first time in a long moment. "Farmers aren't trained to think about time the way that machine thinks about time," he said. "We're trained to measure efficiency in acres per hour. The extension service measures it that way, the equipment dealers measure it that way. Acres per hour, bushels per dollar, return on investment. All horizontal measurements, all forward motion." He paused and picked up a chisel point, turning it in his hands. Warren figured out that some problems aren't horizontal, some problems are vertical. You have to stop moving forward before you can go down far enough to fix them. That's a hard thing for a working farmer to do. It's a hard thing for most people to do. Dale wrote a check to the Harlan County Agricultural Heritage Museum for $12,000. Elias accepted it on behalf of the museum without comment on the amount, though the amount was approximately 40 times what had been discussed. He folded it and put it in the pocket of his Carhartt trousers and went back to the hydraulic cylinder. Dale stood in the barn doorway for a moment before leaving and looked at the Giddings conversion in the afternoon light. It was not beautiful. It was heavy, angular, unpainted in places where the paint had worn through to bare steel that had then oxidized to a deep brown. The chisel points were worn smooth with use. The hydraulic lines were wrapped with electrical tape at 2 junctions where the original fittings had been replaced with something that fit well enough. It was a machine that had been built to solve a specific problem and had solved it across 3 generations without ever once caring whether it impressed anyone. Let me tell you about the years that followed. Dale Cutter did not immediately tell everyone what had happened. He is not at his core an evangelist, but farmers talk, and yield maps are not secret documents. And by the following spring, 3 of his neighbors had asked him about the back 40. He told them the truth, which was that an old man had come with an old machine and done something that all his modern equipment could not do, and if they had a hardpan problem, they should call Elias Cord. Elias treated 4 more farms in the county over the following 3 years. He never charged for the work. He accepted donations to the Heritage Museum, which eventually raised enough to build the display building it had been trying to fund for a decade. The building was named, at the museum board's insistence and over Elias's stated objection, the Warren Cord Agricultural Innovation Center. There is a photograph of the Giddings conversion in the entrance hall, taken the autumn it was restored, with a placard that reads, "Built from salvaged materials, 1957, still in service." Dale changed some things after that November, not everything. He still drove a late-model truck. He still used GPS-guided equipment and precision planting technology and variable-rate inputs. He was not converted to some romantic rejection of modern agriculture. He was more accurate than that. What he changed was the question he asked first. Before he bought a new implement or adopted a new practice, he began asking what physical principle it was based on and whether that principle was actually correct for the problem he was trying to solve, rather than simply whether it was new and whether other people were using it. It sounds like a small change. Well, it was not a small change. His yields across the whole farm improved steadily over the following decade, not because he found more old machines, but because the question changed the way he looked at problems. He began to notice when he was solving the visible symptom and ignoring the underlying condition. He began to notice when he was measuring efficiency in the wrong dimension. He would say later to his son that it was the most important agricultural education he ever received, and that it had come from a man standing in a field, pressing his fingers into the soil with the patient confidence of someone who had been given good knowledge and had kept it alive. Elias Cord died in the March of his 87th year. He died at home in the farmhouse with the porch swing on a cold morning when the frost was on the fence posts, which his family felt was appropriate. He had farmed that hollow until his 84th year and had maintained the Giddings conversion in working condition until the end. His funeral was attended by approximately 300 people, which is a large number for a man who had never held public office and had never sought attention. Many of them were farmers. Several drove significant distances. Dale Cutter sat in the second row. He did not speak at the service, but he stayed afterward for 2 hours and listened to people tell stories about Elias, stories he had not heard before, stories that made clear that the hardpan problem in the back 40 had been the smallest of many things Elias Cord had quietly fixed in that county over the course of his long life. The Giddings conversion passed to Elias's grandson, a young man named Marcus who was 26 at the time of the funeral and had grown up watching his grandfather use it. Marcus had a degree in soil science from the University of Kentucky, which Elias had encouraged him to pursue specifically so that he would understand the physics behind what the machine did rather than simply knowing how to operate it. He had the hydraulic system completely rebuilt the summer after the funeral, upgraded the cylinder seals to modern materials that would last longer, and remounted the implement on a newer tractor with a compatible hydraulic output. He kept the chisel points original. Some things do not need improving. Now let me tell you about the morning 3 years after Elias's funeral, when Dale's son, a young man named Carter, who had grown up watching his father farm and had taken on management of the operation at 24, stood at the edge of a different field with a different problem and the same particular brand of frustrated certainty that his father had once carried. Carter was standing at the edge of the river bottom field, 60 acres that had been rented into the operation 2 years prior, ground that had been farmed intensively by its previous tenant with equipment that was too heavy for bottomland soil. The compaction was severe, concentrated in the top 18 inches, and Carter had spent the better part of the previous growing season trying to address it with a borrowed high horsepower ripper and a cover crop mix recommended by a precision agriculture consultant he had paid handsomely. He had the yield maps to show for it. 91 bushels per acre on ground that should have produced 170. He heard the truck before he saw it. The particular rattling, entirely honest noise of an engine that had never been made quiet. He turned from the field to see a truck come up the access lane, and it was not the same truck. It was a newer vintage, though still emphatically used, but it carried in its bed, under a tarp secured with baling twine, the same angular, unmistakable shape. Marcus Cord stepped out. He was 29 now. He wore canvas work trousers and carried a hand gauge in a leather pouch. "Marcus Cord," he said. "My grandfather farmed the Cord Hollow up past the second ridge for most of his life. I heard you've got a hardpan problem in the river bottom." Carter looked at the shape under the tarp for a moment. Then he looked at Marcus. Then he looked back at the shape under the tarp, and something moved across his face that was not quite recognition and not quite disbelief, but was somewhere between the two, the look of a person standing at the edge of a story they have already been told but are only now beginning to truly understand. He said, My father told me about your grandfather." Marcus nodded once. "I know," he said. "He called me. He thought you might need some help." He paused and looked at the river-bottom field with the same patient, evaluative attention that Elias had once given to the back 40. "Some problems are vertical," he said. "You have to stop moving forward before you can go down far enough to fix them." He said it the way a person said something they were taught by someone who loved them. He said it the way a person says something that needs to outlive the person who first said it. Carter said he would go get his fence pliers and walk the field with him. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built.